My name is Rudaina Al-Balbaki. I'm the International Affairs Program Coordinator here at the Institute. So we are asking this afternoon, can diplomacy avert the escalation in Syria? The question is particularly relevant today as knowing that John Kerry, speaking at the Atlantic Council think tank yesterday, said that the US is on the verge of ending talks on Syria with Russia following days of deadly attacks on Aleppo and the kind of bombing taking place. Allow me to welcome Emile Hokayem, who is Senior Fellow for Middle East Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, based out of its Middle East office in Manama, Bahrain. Kerry also talked about other ways to end the war in Syria. What could be these ways, with tensions rising between Russia and the US and practically no serious sign of change in US foreign policy from now till the end of the term of President Barack Obama? What are the prospects left for great power diplomacy in delivering a nationwide truce and bringing regional powers closer and facilitating progress on political negotiations and humanitarian access? On the ground, despite short-lived de-escalation in some areas, fighting remains intense across Syria, most notably in eastern Aleppo, where at least 96 children have been killed since Friday, according to UNICEF. So what are the opportunities to end that 5-year-long tragedy, where more than 300,000 lost their lives via a political solution? Our lecturer is the author of Syria's Uprising and the Fracturing of the Levant. I'm going to show the book. He has also edited 2 books, so Egypt After the Spring Revolt and Reaction, Middle Eastern Security, the US Pivot and the Rise of ISIS. I am now pleased to hand over to Emile, who will assess the current dynamics of the Syrian conflict and the consequences of these dynamics, most importantly on the future of Syria and its people, and discuss whether the de facto soft partition of the war-torn country can serve as basis for stabilization and future governance. Please, Emile.
Thank you, Rudaina, and good afternoon to all. It's a pleasure to be here at AUB. Thank you to the Issam Institute for hosting me. It's a pleasure for a number of reasons. It's not often that I speak in Lebanon. It's not often that I have an opportunity to bring my mom back to AUB where she studied. Hi, Mom. You know, I'm looking at the audience. My mom is there with her friends and a lot of people I don't know, and that feels like what my wedding would look like in Lebanon if it were to happen. Don't worry, Rudaina. This is not a marriage proposal.
Thank you. My introduction was depressing. Thank you, Emile.
So, well, that's the only joke of the evening, because I'm sorry, but what follows is going to be quite depressing. I've been covering Syria for the past 5 years, and you know, you all feel it. You all see the tragedy next door. What I'm going to try to do today is to give you a sense of the fundamental structural dynamics that are shaping the conflict and the diplomacy. That's what I'm going to do. In the first part of my talk, I'm going to look at the state of play in Syria and try to explain essentially where we are today. It's going to be like a picture, you know, a Polaroid picture of where we are. I'm not going to spend too much time looking at the history of it. And then in the second part of the lecture, I will discuss the diplomacy and try to see if whatever is being done in Geneva, Moscow, Washington, and elsewhere will amount to anything that can level that can lower the level of violence and lead to you know, some kind of political track that can alleviate the suffering of the Syrians, which I think needs to be the priority, but also stabilize politically this country. And then I will try to answer that question, but I think the answer will be quite obvious to most of you. Okay, so first let's look at the state of play in Syria. It's not a pretty one. I'm not going to talk about the humanitarian crisis or anything else. IFI has hosted other people who are better qualified than me, who looked at the humanitarian consequences, the refugee crisis, etc. I'm going to look at the politics and the military dynamics here. And I will argue that the fundamental dynamics of the war play out in Assad's favor today, and decisively so. Up until late 2015, it was fair to say that there was a strategic stalemate in Syria, that essentially what we had seen between 2011, but especially 2012 and 2015, was essentially a seesaw movement. The regime would conquer territory, assert itself, etc., overstretch itself because it has problems of manpower and can't really hold areas. And then the rebels would form coalition, push back, get better weaponry, etc. So essentially a real seesaw up until 2015. The Russian intervention has, I think, decisively shaped battlefield dynamics and, as I'll explain later, the diplomacy around the conflict. The way I would put it is that Assad has, and I'll give some evidence for it a bit later, but has neutralized the strategic threat to his regime's survival. What I mean by this, I'm not saying that he won, because I don't really think there is such a thing as a clear victory in Syria, but he has neutralized the capacity of people fighting him to really undermine his rule in the foreseeable future. So don't misunderstand me. I'm not declaring victory for any side here. I'm just trying to characterize what is not the Assad preference, but something that he can satisfy himself with in the short to medium term. The effect, the result of this is that what we see in Syria today is the de facto soft partition of the country. There is a lot of talk about the redrawing of borders in Syria and the ends of Sykes-Picot, which is really not what's happening, but this is really a shortcut. I don't think that we're going to see the formal collapse of the country, but there is a de facto soft partition that is taking place, and it's very difficult to reverse. And I'll give more evidence and more arguments in favor of that a bit later. The other point here is that the ingredients for another decade of conflict are present. Don't fool yourself into thinking that the various parties are totally exhausted and unwilling to fight. The nature of the fighting is changing profoundly. And again, I'll expand on this in a second. So first, let's look at the regime strategy and how the regime has basically operated in the past year plus. First, the focus has been on what we call useful Syria, Western Syria. Well, all the main infrastructure is present, ports, airports, highways, remaining industry, large urban centers, etc. The regime has really focused on retaking the cities because militarily and politically, that is a very decisive setback for the rebellion, to lose its ability to say that it appeals and it controls urbanites, urban dwellers. And we saw this, especially in the past few months, with quite debilitating setbacks for the rebellion in Damascus, in Homs, and now in Aleppo. The logic from 2012 has been quite simple on the regime side. It's a siege strategy. It's a strategy of depopulation. I don't want to use the word cleansing. That's the more technical, legal one, and one I'm a bit uncomfortable with. But what I mean by a strategy of depopulation is the following. The Assad regime calculates, and very realistically, that all these populations that were disloyal, those largely rural, poor Syrians who happen to be Sunnis, are hopeless, that essentially it's not worth spending $1 or an ounce of political capital or whatever trying to recover their loyalty. So better just kick them out where it makes strategic sense. And look at the beauty of the strategy. I say beauty, please bear with me. It basically shifts the burden of taking care of civilians, of catering to their needs, to the rebels, or neighboring countries, or the UN, or the international community. So in a way, the refugee crisis and the humanitarian crisis is not the unfortunate outcome of the fighting. It's a deliberate regime strategy, and we have to keep this in mind. This is not an accident or you know, the result of the strategy. It is the intended outcome of the strategy, and it has played out exactly this way. The refugee crisis and the attending security crisis, or not necessarily refugees are security crisis, but how it plays out in the psyche of the Lebanese, the Jordanians, the Turks, and Europeans and Americans, etc. That's something that actually has helped the regime make its case. And there's another aspect to the regime strategy. The regime is the only actor in Syria who has a nationwide strategy. First, Assad says it pretty regularly when he gives speeches. He wants to take the whole country. I don't think it's feasible, but that's the stated desire, the preference. But more importantly, the regime controls contiguous territory, which means that the regime is able to shift military resources or attention depending on need. So, you know, today the front in southern Syria is frozen, essentially. So the regime is able to shift resources, air power, etc., to Aleppo, because that's where the big battle is. The rebels don't have that capacity, because they don't control contiguous state. They can't shift troops, weaponry across the country. They don't have air power and firepower to either bomb places or move troops or weaponry. And that matters. That matters because not only Assad continues to pretend that he embodies a state, but he's able to tell Syrians, you know, your average Syrian who is just trying to look for ways to survive this chaos, that he is trying to impose, create a measure of order in the country. Not necessarily order, but coherence. That, you know, somehow you can drive from Daraa, the city of Daraa, all the way to Aleppo, and you feel safe. That's what? That's a winning argument. I mean, you know, we're in Lebanon. Remember when you couldn't drive from AUB to Tripoli? You had to go around the country. I mean, you know, that matters for people who are trying to survive extreme war conditions. So that capacity to have a nationwide strategy is very important. But in parallel, what you have is the reality of the militiafication of the regime. That's a horrendous word, militiafication, but let me try to define it for you. It's essentially the transformation, the willing transformation of the regime into a collection of militia. That's also another strategy that was essential to the survival of the regime. Why am I saying this? The regular conventional military, the Assad military, was in a poor shape even in 2011. And that was not necessarily an instrument of domestic control or external security. I mean, you know, it's not as if the mighty Syrian army was able to retake the Golan Heights or whatever, right? It was a system of patronage and control that was not necessarily operational control. The operational coercive control was in the hands of your mukhabarat security agencies. It's important. So when the uprising started, Assad was faced with the reality that he had limited resources, that his military was not that reliable. It could defect, it could challenge him. You know, strong generals could mount a challenge possibly, although that was always a fantasy rather than a reality, and so on. So what did he do? And that was, I think, a very conscious decision. He basically accepted the rise of self-defense, communal self-defense militias. You know, people who basically control their neighborhood, protect their neighborhood. Why is that? A, because they cost less. If you are a fighter, who you eat at home, you eat whatever your mom and or wife cooks, and you're in charge of your immediate territory, that's good enough for Assad because it allows him to dedicate the rest of his forces to other battlefields. So what we've seen since 2012, with the rise of the NDF, the National Defense Forces, and a bunch of other militia, is the rise of warlordism under the regime. Now, no one, it has, of course, challenged the coherence, the cohesion of the regime, but not in debilitating ways yet. I mean, I think that's a real challenge for Assad down the road because those militias can be either highly trained, highly disciplined, highly capable militias, or they can be a bunch of gangsters. And we see that, the rapacious, predatory groups that essentially live off the checkpoint or the smuggling and the trading, etc. So that's a bit where the regime is today. Now let's look at the rebellion. The rebellion, I would say, is less fragmented than it was before, but it has coalesced in ways that are bit problematic, and when I say bit, it's an understatement. The rebellion in the south is essentially neutralized, the so-called Southern Front. That's still the largest standing non-Islamist anti-Assad rebel force. It gets support from the Americans, the Jordanians, the Gulf states, etc. But today, it essentially serves as a border force for Jordan, and to prevent ISIS, Nusra from putting pressure on the Hashemite kingdom. The Southern Front is being massively criticized these days by Syrians who want the Southern Front to attack from the south to relieve Aleppo. But that goes back to my point earlier, that the rebellion cannot conduct a nationwide strategy. It's too fragmented to do that. In the north, the rebellion is dominated by Islamists and jihadis as well, but mostly Islamists. And let's not mix those two categories and oversimplify the situation there. The problem in the north is that this is the most complex human terrain one can think of in this war, and probably more. You have ISIS. You have an international campaign against ISIS. You have the Kurds. You have a Turkish intervention against the Kurds. You have Arab, Turkmen, Kurdish movements. You have nationalist, small nationalist forces in Idlib. You have much larger Islamist ones there. I mean. The north is just such a complex terrain, and it's complex in part because we didn't take it seriously, because there was no real attempt to organize those rebel forces for some time, and I'll get to this in more detail. And essentially what happened in the north is that I think the Americans gave up. They said, you know what, it's too Islamist, it's too complex, we're focusing on the campaign against ISIS, it's too painful to deal with the Turks, it's too much of everything. And what this has created, I think, is more fragmentation, more atomization in the north. This, combined with the regime push in Aleppo, means that the rebellion is very much in danger of turning into a rural insurgency, no longer like a rebellion that captures the minds of people. And I'm not saying that they are capturing the minds. I'm just saying that they're losing even that claim at this point. So, a lot of people focus on rebel gains in Hama these days. It's true, they are, but they are conquering small villages in the countryside. They're not conquering strategic territory in the cities. And guess what? It's not only the rebellion is becoming more radical, but it's because of that, and because it's turning into a more rural insurgency, it becomes harder to support it politically and militarily. And that's where we are on this front. Now, let's quickly look at the Kurdish situation. And I want to just warn you, I'm not a specialist on the Kurds. There are people who do a much better job at covering that aspect. But here is what I gather from the smarter brains on this issue. Essentially, Kurdish expansionism, the creation of that contiguous entity that's called Rojava and so on, is a reality of the conflict. The Kurds have been very disciplined since 2011, 2012. They've been extremely opportunistic, and opportunism is the highest form of strategy. You know, the ability to see where you can make gains at acceptable costs, and over time grow. And the Kurds have really had their break in 2014 when they emerged, in Western eyes in particular, as the most efficient, the most reliable, the most structured force to fight ISIS. And ever since, the Kurds have grown and, well, they've crossed the Euphrates. And now, and thanks to Western support, but now we see the limits of Kurdish ambitions with the entry of the Turks. The Turks are fighting ISIS, but they're fighting ISIS primarily to check Kurdish nationalism, Syrian Kurdish nationalism, for fear that it would somehow spill over on their own country. So here is a major dilemma: is that the fight against ISIS is scoring points, but it's scoring points in a way that only exposes the fact that pre-ISIS fault lines have not been healed, and in fact, the fight against ISIS has only exacerbated those fault lines. So we're just entering a new phase of fighting in Syria. I mean, not only in Syria, we can look at Iraq as well, where Kurdish Peshmergas and Shia militias have already clashed in north of around Kirkuk, north of Baghdad, and other places. Finally, the final actor I want to look at here are the jihadis. The jihadi scene in Syria is extremely complex. We tend to focus on Daesh and Nusra. They are other actors. They're not as big as those two. But Syria really has created, has opened the third era of jihadism, and one that is extremely concerning, because the numbers of jihadis we talk about these days is more greater than anything we have seen before. I'm going to focus on Sunni jihadis here. There's also a large movement of Shia jihadis. I mean, people who travel all the way from Pakistan and Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and even Lebanon to go and fight in Syria. So that's another aspect to keep in mind. Now, ISIS is weakening, and I'll talk a bit more about this later. But the reality is that what I think is the real jihadi challenge, Nusra, that is a challenge that is growing. Essentially, Nusra has undergone a rebranding, 2 months ago, when it became Jabhat Fath al-Sham. The way I put it is that Nusra has moved 1 inch to the left to try and attract other groups and ask them to move like an entire mile to the right. And I think it's a very dangerous period where the appeal of Nusra is growing, both militarily and politically. But as far as I'm concerned, Nusra, what's the saying? A leopard cannot change its spots, essentially. Nusra remains a jihadi group. The break with Al-Qaeda, it sounds good, but if anything, I would argue that Syria is becoming a prime Al-Qaeda ground. The problem with Nusra is that, contrary to ISIS, it's been a bit smarter in how it did things. ISIS essentially is a jihadi hegemonic movement with a claim for governance. They conquered territory, they said we're a state, they planted a flag, and they said, hey, we're going to deliver services, we're going to expand, we're going to do all these things. Well, when you go after the sources of income, the leadership, the fighters of ISIS, etc., you erode the sense of success that made ISIS such a powerful recruiting force. I mean, the number of jihadi fighters joining ISIS is crumbling in Syria and Iraq. And second, the other jihadis are actually making fun of ISIS for being overly ambitious. Nusra chose another strategy. It essentially embedded itself in Syrian society, in the Syrian population, not all across the country, but it did so it did so by telling Syrians, hey, we're going to embrace what is your top priority, which is fighting Assad. Okay. And guess what? That's appealing. don't know how many of you take political science classes and so on, but there's this great Yale scholar, Stathis Kalvias, who wrote several books about how civilians operate in conflict. I mean, he looked at many aspects of conflict, but his work is brilliant on this. And we Lebanese who lived the war can relate a bit to that. It's about survival for most people. It's really much about tactical choices. People accept whomever is willing or able to provide some measure of order and services in a particular territory. It's not necessarily ideological commitment. And people's loyalties, professed loyalties or real loyalties, vary massively depending on the reading of the battlefield dynamics. Who is winning at a specific moment? Which is, by the way, a reason why I think that Assad today, I would say his negative popularity is growing because he is seen as willing. So civilians are less likely to hedge and to think in terms of who else can protect us, etc., because the cost of finding another protector is very high. Anyway, it's all very complex, and we can talk about this. I don't want to throw. I don't want to throw too many poli-sci terms at you. You can throw them at me later, and we can do that. So that's a bit the state of play in Syria. As you can all agree, it's a bit distressing. By the way, this is being broadcast.
It's being live tweeted on and live streamed on Periscope. And would you please use the hashtag Syrian crisis to ask questions and comment? Thank you, Emile.
Of course. So that was my depressing state of play. Now let's talk about diplomacy. It's not going to get better, right? Dr. Mitri is here, and he was a diplomat. I still think he is a diplomat to navigate university politics. So he probably is going to correct me a million times here. But let me tell you a bit about the diplomatic environment that we're dealing with. Diplomacy is about understanding what your interests are and figuring out what leverage you have to push at what point. And here, it's important to understand the difference between preferences and policies. Is Barack Obama's preference for Assad to go? Yes. Is it his policy? No. Okay, I can break this down for every actor in the conflict. I just want you to be very aware of that when I continue. The other point I want to make is about leverage. We all use that word, but it's very important to understand that leverage doesn't exist in absolute terms. It exists in context. It's all relative, and it's leverage. And leverage can be exercised towards a variety of actors: your foes, your partners, your allies, etc. And leverage here, it's about what? It's about commitment. It's about credibility, and it's about perception. You need people to believe that you're committed, and you have some muscle to deploy, some punishment to visit on those who disagree with you or in the process of a negotiation. I think in the context of great power diplomacy over Syria, the U.S. lacks massive leverage. And I'm just opening the chapter of U.S. bashing here, so bear with me for the next 10, 15 minutes because I'm going to be pretty harsh on that thing. When Russia intervened in Syria last year, what was one of Obama's first statements? He said, "I'm not interested in fighting a proxy war in Syria," which is totally understandable. Perhaps that's better for American interests. But in doing that, he signaled to the other party that he was unwilling to conduct any kind of escalation, and that, in a way, he wasn't going to even preserve ambiguity as a policy instrument. And I think that is one of the key mistakes in a long line of American mistakes here. What is the logic of great power diplomacy when it comes to Syria? First, the UN is a mediator. The UN is a bit irrelevant actor. The UN matters if everyone else agrees. which is a probably problematic situation, right? I mean, you would want these guys to be a bit more driving the process and so on, but that's not the case. Poor Staffan de Mistura. The logic of diplomacy is the following. It's the idea that the great powers, US and Russia, will, because their positions are somehow closer, will be able to exercise leverage or to pressure, compel the regional allies, so for the US, the Gulf states, Turkey, etc., and in terms of Russia, Iran, who would in turn pressure their local allies. I mean, it's a beautiful construct. I'm sure PhD dissertations are going to be written about this thing. Looks good on paper, except that things are really not playing out this way. I mean, and that essentially was the logic of Staffan de Mistura starting to 2014 and on, when he had his contact group. And before going into detail, let's also keep in mind one thing. Diplomacy is a great thing. It needs to be tried. But there's always a cost to diplomacy. But guess what? There's also a cost to the failure of diplomacy. And if you don't integrate those two costs into your approach from the beginning, by coming up with contingency plans, by thinking in terms of enforcement, your diplomacy may actually end up causing more trouble than fixing anything. And I would argue that this is a bit what happened in the past year. So, the argument, and that John Kerry made a couple of days ago, at least we're trying, that's not a really acceptable argument. I mean, no one is gonna, that actually may be a book about US diplomacy under Obama saying, so leading from behind, and at least we're trying. That is not going to, it's going to be a bestseller. Perhaps I should try to write it, but it's not going to be a very powerful doctrine for everything. And the problem here is that we often get taken by well-intentioned ideas, and I'll give an example, that end up actually being disastrous. I'm going to give you an example. Remember, when I talked about the regime's depopulation strategy? Well, guess what is the idea that the UN embraced starting 2014? Local ceasefires. The idea that you can freeze conflict here and there. Well, look at what local ceasefires have ended up doing. Baba Amr, the downtown Hamas, Daraya, possibly Ma'azamiya and other places, etc. Zabadani, etc. It's actually the risk is that diplomacy may feed into the strategy of one of the two sides of one of the many sides to the war. And the Aleppo freeze is a great example of that as well. So. Yes, we hear local ceasefires, and it makes us feel good because at a certain point, yes, there are civilians in a specific place who will benefit from the lowering of violence. But okay, you lower the violence, but if you don't allow food or aid to come in, what have you done? You've actually neutralized a certain place. And then guess what? You have limited resources, but suddenly you're not fighting here. You can go fight elsewhere. And that is the perverse effect of some diplomatic tactics, things that we see in Syria today. So, and I can go on and on about other perverse effects, but let me give you a couple of clear examples. The cessation of hostilities, the agreement that was negotiated in February of this year, that lasted for a few weeks. It had no monitoring mechanism. It had no institutionalized monitoring mechanism. It was essentially people contacting a bunch of guys sitting in Geneva on WhatsApp, reporting local saying. It wasn't a UN-designed system. Perhaps the UN couldn't have done it, and that was the best around. But, that was a pretty weak monitoring system. And the Americans and the Russians were supposed to decide what was a real violation and what wasn't. So try to imagine the situation. It lacked an enforcement mechanism. There was no punishment for the various groups on the ground breaking the ceasefire. More importantly, Russia was both a judge and a judge to the cessation of fire, but was also a party to the conflict. And Russia did break the ceasefire. So, you're sitting across the table from Russia in Geneva, and you'll say, hey, you broke the ceasefire. Like, no, we haven't. and that's it. The process is paralyzed because that's the mechanism you have. So that's another very deficient, very deficient. And finally, on this one is, the day the ceasefire collapsed, the Russians could escalate. You know, that's the contingency plan. They could impose a cost on that. The Americans had no plan B. I mean, you know, John Kerry said he had a plan B, and then he said, no, I don't have a plan B. The plan B is to try and try and try again. So you don't have a way to escalate. So you don't look credible. You know, the other party can actually impose, has what you call escalation dominance in this context. So, you know, and the other, saving grace of the cessation of fire is that it was supposed to be a nationwide ceasefire. Guess what? It was tested very early on, and then it broke into a series of local ceasefire, which is the very opposite of what was desirable in this context. And that's also very, very problematic. So let me talk a bit about the strategy of the, you know, that was a background for diplomacy. Let me talk a bit about the strategies and the leverage of the US and Russia in particular, because, well, these are the guys on the picture. You know, I can talk about the regional aspect of that. I talked a lot about it and written a lot, but today I'm going to focus on great power diplomacy. The point about diplomacy is the following. Because the United States made a decision, and we can agree or disagree with that it wouldn't use coercive power and all that. Since 2013 and since the chemical weapons deal, the US has essentially hid behind the hope, or one might say delusion, that Russia could actually be a diplomatic partner that could deliver something, whether it is a local ceasefire or a regional arrangement or a political track, etc. And here's the trick. The diplomacy had life in itself for some time because of the following differential. Russia, you know, there was always an assumption that Russia had this massive leverage over Assad, which I'm going to dispute in a second. But what mattered is not whether Russia had necessarily leverage over Assad or not. It's comparing Russian leverage over Assad to American leverage over the rebels. It is that differential that is important. It's that differential that made, you know, that in a way set diplomacy and that gave Russia an upper hand in this game. Now, I would argue that this is an untested hypothesis. And in fact, I'm going to try to demonstrate that it's actually not a warranted assumption at all of diplomacy. But it's important to understand that it is that differential that matters in the perception. Because remember, leverage is largely about perception. So let me argue that Russia's leverage over Assad, Putin's leverage over Assad, has actually been exaggerated. I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and feel free to push back against all this in the Q&A. Let's first look at the chemical weapons attacks. Seems like old history, but that was only like 3-4 years ago. Moscow did not like that Assad was using chemical weapons. It was an embarrassment for Moscow because it's a great power. It sits on the UN Security Council. If there are few things that Russia and the others agree on, is the importance of not deploying WMD, and especially in this case chemical weapons, on the battlefield. I don't think that the Russians wanted Assad to do it, but I think first the Russians didn't have good enough intelligence to know what Assad was doing. And that's really pushing back against an assumption that a lot of people make, that somehow the Russians know everything about the system. I actually don't think that's the case. I think the Russian knowledge of Syria has really decreased in the 90s and later on. The second point is that it was embarrassing for the Russians in terms of their client, their allies, doing things that could actually precipitate an intervention. I think the Russians in 2013, wanted to avoid another American intervention in the region, and essentially also saw a way to come back into the game. They made the offer to disarm Assad. I would argue that the disarmament effort was profoundly flawed, and if anything, what we know today is that Assad has retained a chemical weapon capability and is conducting chlorine attacks. Chlorine was not part of the 2013 deal, but still, the use of chlorine as a chemical weapon is illegal under the CWC convention. Another example of the Russians and Assad not being necessarily aligned, the cessation of hostilities. I do believe that the Russians wanted Assad to decisively de-escalate. And Assad played hard at the beginning and then, abided and then broke it. Because the cessation of hostilities in a way, and that's in the words of the French ambassador to the UN and French foreign minister, etc., the cessation of hostilities served as a cover for a regrouping and a reorganizing of the Assad forces. So it was very difficult to get Assad to abide by the terms that Russia itself had negotiated. Another example, very recent, Daraya. Russia, Moscow, was not on board with the evacuation of Daraya, this depopulation element. But they couldn't do much. Essentially, those who matter are those who are on the battlefield, not necessarily the ones flying the planes, in those situations. And Daraya was besieged, was starved, and essentially caved, and people moved on. That was not Moscow's preference. Another example, and I'll talk a bit more about this later, is Russia is struggling on one key component of its intervention in Syria. It is struggling to reorganize and modernize the Assad military. One of the key objectives of Moscow when it went in was to basically bring more coherence to all those militias that I described earlier, the militification. In part because Russia as a state doesn't like to operate this way. They prefer to have a state actor in front of them, etc. In part because militias are primarily a strategy of Iran rather than Russia as a state. This is what the Iranians do best. And there were tensions. But guess what? The situation is too advanced. I mean, Farah, you know this from Yemen. I mean, how do you bring all these guys together? There's one example in recent history where the opposite has happened. It was in Bosnia, where actually, especially on the Serb side, but also on the Croat side, where actually they started as militias and they came together as a national army. In the Arab world, it's usually the opposite that happens. You start as an army, you break up, and then you turn into a collection of militias. Your weaponry seeps into the population. You have various warlords who emerge, etc. So that's a very important element of the Russian strategy that is not being met today. A year into the intervention, it's very difficult to say that Russia has been able to create or recreate, a core Syrian military, and so on. So my argument here is that Russian influence, very paradoxically, may have actually decreased since the intervention. Moscow arrived in Damascus. The Russians arrived in Damascus, and what they realized is that Assad equals regime equals state. That essentially you didn't have that many options. You're stuck with the guy, but guess what? You're stuck, but you can't pressure him too much because he's weak enough that if you pressure him or you let others pressure him, he's going to collapse, and then you've intervened and you're stuck in a war situation. So that's the worst, the late years of Afghanistan in the 80s. So you have to stand by him, and you stand by him in good and bad times. You stand by him even when he publicly goes and says, I want to reconquer all of Syria, when your foreign minister the day before said, no, the objectives are more limited and we want to kick out the terrorists from Aleppo. It's very difficult to miss the tensions between the two. But I assume that a bunch of people, especially in the first rows, are married. And you're all in weddings and in marriages, and you all know that you have to negotiate, and you can be very frustrated, and you have preferences that will not be met, right? I think Russia and Putin and Assad are in an unhappy marriage right now, but the returns, the overall returns of that marriage are still worth staying together. You still have the cool car, and you matter internationally, and you're poking the eyes of international powers. So you're not going to break that, even though it's painful operationally and politically. So in a way, Assad's weakness is strength in that perspective. I don't want to overstate that argument, but it's important to understand that. And Assad has another element in his toolbox. If he disagrees, if he and Russia disagrees, there's always the Iranians to use. It's a triangle that is quite volatile. So what were Russia's goals when Russia entered? Well, first to save Assad by changing battlefield dynamics and setting international diplomacy. I would argue that's done. Number two, it's, well, exactly, reorganize the Syrian Arab Army and the National Defense Forces. That hasn't been met. The third one is to actually understand what's happening in Syria, because I suspect that the Russians didn't really understand that much. Being there on the ground and so on is greater, but also to create possible options. I think the Russians also think in terms of contingency planning. And fourth, and that's a key point, is to basically entangle the US in Russian strategy. What the Russians want is to slowly bring the US, get the US to align with Russian objectives. Okay? They tried to do this against ISIS. There were offers of military coordination, etc. The Americans said, no, we're not going to go down this road. They're doing it now, or the negotiations have collapsed over the deal, but they've done it over Nusra. Okay, let's align together. Let's do joint targeting or joint information sharing for targeting, etc. And that, I think, is one of the greatest ironies of the conflict. Barack Obama resisted going into Syria. Makes total sense in terms of American interests, because he was afraid of another entanglement in the Middle East. And that can make total sense given America's very unhappy time in Iraq and elsewhere. But he's ending up being entangled in Russian strategy in Syria. And of course, the cost may not be the same, but only if you're focusing on the small region. But if you're looking at global politics, if you're looking at Ukraine, if you're looking at cyber attacks and whatever, these costs are cumulative. You actually look like you've been played if you're Kerry or Obama these days in terms of Russia. You don't push back on this thing. Not only you don't push back, you're sometimes almost embedded in the strategy. This is what the Russians have been trying to do. The Americans said yes because their only objective now is to bring down the levels of violence. I think the Americans, Obama doesn't want to leave power with a massive tragedy on his hands. Well, guess what? Actually, in this particular case, sometimes diplomacy tends to exacerbate the very problem it aims to solve, and that's a typical example of that. The Russian intervention hasn't turned into the quagmire that Obama, Kerry, Blinken, and others have told us it would become, precisely because the Russians have calibrated their military involvement. Very limited ground troops, mostly air power, careful about casualties. They don't publicize them as much. The operation doesn't cost that much on a daily basis. My and my colleagues estimate it's around $6 million a day, $200 million a month. It's an acceptable cost for the kind of returns that you're getting internationally and regionally. You look tough, you look committed. A Gulf official once told me, an Arab official once told me, Emile, I don't like what Putin does, but I like how he does it. And I think that's, perception matters massively in the region, and it's actually not that expensive an operation when you think about it. There was a flawed assessment early on by the US administration that somehow it is going to be a quagmire, so therefore the Russians are going to have to define down their objectives, and once they do this, the Americans can come in the game and try to shape diplomacy. It hasn't played out this way. It played the other way around. It's not, the Americans are not here to save Putin's lunch. It's perhaps the other way around at times. So the exposure and the investment is limited and is justifiable. I think the Russians make up their objectives as they go. They see where they're scoring points and they push more. That doesn't create a ground for great power diplomacy. If anything, it creates the ground for a lot of tactical positioning and posturing. Now, the point about Russian, one of Russia's objectives being to entangle the US is essential, because Succeeding in doing so would tie not just the hands of Obama today, but the future administration. A lot of people think that policy making is about stating your preferences and pursuing them. No, policy making is about circumstances and your leverage at a certain point. Would Hillary Clinton, would she want to have a different approach to Syria? Yes, I have absolutely no doubts. Read, what people around her write, look at her own position on a million different issues that are related to the Middle East. But come, January 2015, unless the orange guy makes it, it's circumstances that will dictate what she can do or not. So, it would be a mistake for people to overinvest in that hope. That's not how it happens. So the Russian strategy, in a way, was to either tie the Americans in a deal, in an arrangement, or, and this is what's happening today, score decisive victories on the ground. Just essentially do what I described early on as being done by the Assad regime, which is control the cities, turn the rebellion into a rural insurgency that is more radical, more difficult to support operationally and politically, and then turn to the Americans and say, hey, admit what's happening. That, in a way, explains a lot in the current diplomacy and how it's playing out. Now, there is also another element. The Russian intervention, crucially, has raised the cost for any diplomatic, any foreign intervention. We saw this when the Turks shot down the aircraft. The Turks couldn't maintain the escalation. They didn't have escalation dominance. Who did have the escalation dominance? The Russians. They imposed an economic and political cost to the Turks. They went after the Turkmen rebel groups that Turkey was supported. They made them bleed. And then, a million things happened in Ankara, including the coup. And Turkey had to essentially realign, define down its objectives and so on. A few years ago, Turkey's threat perception was the following, or priorities in Syria. It was Assad, the Kurds, ISIS. Today, it's the Kurds, ISIS, Assad. That matters, how you recalibrate your things. So, and that's because Russia raised the cost for intervention, but crucially, it also deterred intervention in a number of for a number of countries. Look at the case of Jordan. Jordan has been spooked by the Russian deployment in Syria. And this explains to a large extent why the Southern Front is under such constraints. So my argument here is that Russian leverage is not as big as people think it is, but US leverage is even lower than people think it is. That's predictable and predicted. US policy has essentially been one of calculated dithering and post-facto rationalization. So, when you talk to American officials, they tell you, thank God we didn't do more in Syria, look at the mess it is, we would have been involved in that. My response to them is that had you been involved, you would have perhaps have had more options, more leverage to do something else, right? I mean, their argumentation is very linear in this regard, but that's where we are. We're clear in that sense, not through their public declarations, but their priorities were the Iran nuclear diplomacy, and second, not being entangled in the region. Barack Obama didn't like coming back to the region to fight ISIS, but that he calculated would have been the stain on his record. And then it was actually not that difficult to go after ISIS because you define a narrow counterterrorism strategy that is in a way largely politics-free. This is what we had today. So the fight against ISIS, contrary to what Washington hoped, didn't become the organizing principle of regional politics. ISIS is everyone's enemy, and everyone is ISIS' enemy. But no one considers ISIS their top threat, right? If you're Turkey, you worry more about the Kurds. If you're the rebels, you worry more about Assad. If you're Assad, you worry more about the rebels. If you're the Gulf states, okay, you don't like ISIS, but hey, they bloodied Maliki's nose, and you worry more about Yemen. It's this web of entanglement, and it didn't serve as the basis for a healthier regional architecture in this regard. So I'm going to stop soon, I promise you. Yeah, 5 more minutes. My parents know, like, he's such a talker, this guy, from the moment he was born, and they have, proof of that. But so my point here is that in a way, the way diplomacy was set up was not in a way that could avert escalation. This is not what we've seen, is at best a flawed conflict management mechanism, but certainly not a conflict resolution mechanism. If one of the two sides is unwilling to impose a cost to a party that infringes a de-escalation or a process, then there is escalation dominance on the other side, and that's plenty clear in this regard. And guess what? Time plays here in favor, I think, of the Russians and the regime, because the discourse is shifting. In terms of ISIS being the greater evil, Assad, being, he's a bad guy, but he doesn't kill minorities. I mean, that's as simplistic as it gets. But hey, it's something quite popular within, leftist and Christian conservative circles, etc. And you see how the goals are, the rhetoric around Syria is changing. So I would argue that the fundamental elements for diplomacy are not here. I would say that actually it's the opposite. I think the potential for unbridled escalation is great. I'm going to stop here. I had planned on talking about also U.S. leverage on rebel groups, but I think this is going to come up in your questions. I will just say that the U.S. intervention in Syria, which was non-lethal until late 2012, early 2013, and lethal since then, was never designed to change battlefield dynamics, to shape them. It was designed to constrain rebel groups. It was designed to have an eye to have relationship, but it was never meant to help the military victory. And I think military victory was not achievable to start with. But the other side always saw it as such. And that's the problem, is that you want to keep ambiguity when you're involved in these things. So the US is often a follower of battlefield changes, not an initiator. I mean, the best example is what happened in the spring of 2015 when Jaish al-Fatah conducted this a campaign that threatened Latakia. I mean, that was, a real issue, and probably the main driver of the Russian intervention, because, Assad was weakening really quickly, much faster than most people believed, and largely because of the militification factor. And the Americans actually told the rebel groups, okay, join the campaign, because, we need to keep an eye, we need to be part of that thing, otherwise, we won't have any lever. We won't be able to matter in the politics the day after. So let me end here, and thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Emile. I'll now open the floor to questions. Oh my God. Okay, then we'll take 2 questions at a time, and let us please try to keep it down to 2 minutes, because I see many hands up. 5 questions. Emile, is that okay?
Yeah,
okay. And I also invite you to ask your questions in Arabic if you prefer to do so, and I'll be ready to translate them. So please go ahead. Sorry, would you please say your name before starting?
People can hear my voice.
Your voice is
Thank
famous.
you. Thanks very much for the interesting talk, Emile. I'm Alice Fordham. I'm a correspondent for National Public Radio here. As we're talking about diplomacy, we're about 2 weeks after a period of very intense diplomacy, and you talked about the leverage of the Russians over Assad and his forces. But you haven't talked so much about intent. I mean, after the most recent agonizingly negotiated cessation of hostilities. We saw very quickly a breakdown in security that might have indicated the Russians didn't have a huge amount of leverage over Assad, but then subsequently all the evidence indicated that the Russians were responsible for a stepped-up aerial campaign to include a gruesome bombing on an aid convoy, which would kind of indicate to me that all the reasons that we thought the Russians had for wanting to negotiate, for wanting to be re-embraced by the Americans, maybe for Ukraine or whatever it was, wanting to have direct military-to-military cooperation with the Americans, that they never wanted it in the first place, in which case, why did they bother?
Thank you, Alice. Please, Dr. Fuad.
Thank you. My name is Fuad from AUB. Emile, thank you very much. But if we just, being away from the current situation now and looking for the bigger picture, what you talked about and what's, all these issues about military intervention, diplomacy, are happening in this useful Syria. So what about the two big parts of Syria, the Kurdish part and what they called it Central Syria, where ISIS and other, so Eastern Syria, let's say Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, and so where are those two parts in this major picture? The other, question is about this demographic change when talking about this huge number of people that left, their places either inside Syria or outside. So what's the role of, what's the impact of this, in this picture of negotiation or diplomacy? Thank you.
Alexandra.
Thanks very much, Emile. I guess I also have a question about the Russian leverage over Assad, and just to question that without Russian air power, how could have Assad achieved all of his battlefield gains? And so my question is, in that aspect, Assad would have had a lot to lose if he had to capitulate something to the Russians. He could not have made all these gains in Aleppo against the rebels. He could not have achieved so much as he have without the air power, unless you think without the Russian air power, the militias on the ground alone would have been enough to sustain the same battlefield gains. And then sort of a two-part question, in that sense, do you think there are things the US can do to pressure more the Russians to therefore pressure Assad, like strategies the US has used with regards to Ukraine in the past, such as sanctions? And where do we stand now on the US policy front of a no-fly zone or a safe zone with regards to the next president, whether it's Hillary or someone else? Thank you, Emile.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks. I have two questions. First, you talked about the Americans are kind of entangled in the Russian policies in Syria. But I think, why can't we understand the situation in the opposite way, that where the Americans are just keeping their forces, their money, everything outside of the equation, and just everyone is entangled in the no American intervention. Like, for example, you just said that the Russians were kind of driven to intervene in Syria because Assad was about to lose some strategic points in Syria, and the Russians have certain interest in the coastal area of Syria. But the Obama administration stated from the beginning that they have no interest, or they have no strategic interest in Syria, which means that at the same time they don't have interest in toppling the regime, and they don't have, they want the regime to be there at the same time because they want the state. So maybe it could be the opposite way, that the Americans, the Russians, are getting, Russians, Iranians, and the Turks are getting involved in a dirty game where the Americans got out with a clear hands. And the second is is it really that people in Syria now, after the displacements and millions left the country, are driven by the idea of protection? For example, ISIS is also providing protection for people, and also the same example of movement of people on very movement also between Iraq and Syria. So is it really that people's opinion now in Syria is driven by the idea of like protection or like protecting forces? Thanks.
May I ask the fifth question? I wanted to, I'd like to hear more about U.S.'s relation to opposition forces and hear more about the regional powers leverage, Turkey, KSA. You know, it's been like the accusation of to rebel forces that they have been receiving military aid and empowered by the regional power. How much is this precise? Thank you.
Sure. Get ready for another hour now. I promise. I'll try to be brief. Alice, I think the Russians did debate the advantages, the merits, the risk, the calculations of the deal versus territorial gains. And I do think at one point they really wanted the deal. The deal would have legitimized so much. I mean, where's the, actually, I printed it because I wanted to read it for you guys. But, yesterday, Phil Gordon, who used to be Obama's top Middle East advisor, you know, very nice guy, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, explaining why Putin made a mistake by rejecting the deal. And that's how he put it, and I'm totally quoting here. With the September 12 US-Russia ceasefire agreement, by the way, he made a mistake. It's not September 12, it's September 9. But with September 12 US-Russia ceasefire agreement, the US administration offered Putin a way forward that from a Russian perspective could have only been described as a clean win. If fully implemented, the agreement would have prevented regime change in Damascus, a major Putin red line, for the foreseeable future, boosted Russia's position as a major power in the Middle East, facilitated military and intelligence cooperation with the United States against terrorist groups, diminished a costly conflict, and secured Russia's Mediterranean base. From Moscow's perspective, that would not be a bad day's work. I mean, I'm sorry, I hope all of you guys have heard what I said, or just go on the Washington Post website and read it again. This is someone who, you know, a very smart thinker, who was Obama's top Middle East advisor until last year, who is, you know, a proponent of de-escalation and no longer talking about a political transition in Syria. It's purely de-escalation, making deals with the Russians, etc. Left the White House a year ago, who actually is laying out the benefits of the deal. And the benefits of the deal are quite massive, you know. I mean, now the question is, why did Russia reject this? Because it's a very sweet deal. I think first, the Russians looked at how the pushback in the United States against the deal, including the Pentagon and other places, and said, you know, can this thing hold? Can we agree on this and so on? I mean, it would have been good for Russia to say yes, and that the deal would have failed because the Americans wouldn't have implemented their part of it. But I think the calculation was else, is that there are ways to get all this a bit later, because the Americans have no plan B. You make military advances, territorial advances where it matters, and guess what? That deal is still on the table. A week ago, you know, John Kirby and Josh Earnest would say, you know, our patience is not limitless. Yesterday it was, what's the plan? Well, you know, the deal is still on the table, and it's not that John Kerry didn't say we're leaving the negotiation. He said we're thinking about the steps we need to initiate leaving. I mean, you know, they're designing a long process. And finally, my point here, which goes to say, you know, Obama always very eloquently makes the case that talking to your adversaries is not a reward in itself. What is Kerry doing here? He's basically leaving the dialogue is a punishment. I'm like, if it's not a reward to start with, how can it be a punishment? Okay, and this is what I'm saying here is quite fundamental in how you conduct diplomacy. It's beyond the case of Syria. Okay? We got into this thing because Putin knows that this is not Obama's priority. So he's scoring the military victories because they're taking the fighting seriously. They're not saying there's no military solution. They understand that there is a military approach to a political solution, and they're doing it. And on the other side, you see a lot of dithering. So, sorry. I told you it's going to be long. Professor Fouad, what's beyond useful Syria? I mean, the sad thing about what's beyond useful Syria is that you have a Syria, which is, Rojava in Kurdish terms, which is the one place where you do have a central, the weak administration and, a sense of territorial continuity, services deliveries, etc. And then you have another one that is essentially free for all. So the territory that is controlled by ISIS is essentially up for grabs. Anyone who can fight ISIS will keep that territory, right? So it is not really part of the current discussion because, Rojava is a place that no one is going to touch for the moment. I think the Turks are not going to be crazy enough to touch Rojava. The Americans will really not be happy with that. The regime itself has been divided over how to deal with the Kurds. You have the moderates in Damascus who basically say, let's worry about Rojava the day after. And then you have the hardliners, and we saw what happened in Kamishli and Hasake, who said, no, we have to assert state presence. Well, the balance of power is not in their favor, so that's a fight for another day. So Rojava, in a way, is a bit stable. And I think the question is how much it can expand. And then the Turks have said, Euphrates, and that's the end of it. Saying exactly, and yeah, you go in the other direction. But the fight against ISIS is where you can score territorial gains. And by the way, that's important because the only foreign intervention scenario in Syria, direct intervention, to help the rebels, which was in people's mind, was to actually go after ISIS and any territory recovered from ISIS giving to the rebels. Because you're not going to fight Assad. That would the cost of direct escalation here would have been too great. So you fight ISIS, and anything you get from ISIS, you give it to the rebels. That is what could have happened a year plus ago. That was the idea of the Turkish safe zone in the summer of 2015. The Obama administration was not interested in it, and the Turks themselves had many operational issues, etc. So that's where we are. Demographic change. Look, there is demographic change. Last week I think Assad and Hezbollah reopened the Luxor, the border point. That would not have happened if they hadn't secured the area. And we know a bit how that was secured. It wasn't pretty. You have this in other places across Syria. But I'm not saying that, I don't want to go into the whole sectarian cleansing paradigm because we're not there yet. It's a risk, but we're not there yet. I think the regime is pushing people out in two directions. By the way, the rebels have also pushed a lot of people out. And, rebel behavior, I haven't been tough enough on the rebels, but, always keeping in mind that, whether it's in Aleppo and Idlib and other places, the rebels are no angels, except that their approach is not as structured as they commit abuses, but it is not the same strategic intent. It could be a lot worse if they had the capability. Okay, that's the difference on this front. But the point here is that you have demographic change in some areas, but it's not. I would say it's not the most important at this point. The most important characteristic of the conflict. The broader point is to say, look, all Arab countries are losing their diversity, ethnic, religious, etc. It's a sad thing. People are congregating in one place or leaving, etc. So the threat is more societal and on the long term rather than just a feature of the conflict on the thing. Alexandra, yes, Russian air power was key to Assad's coming back in the game big time. The question is whether the Russians can afford to deny air power to him, and I think that's not the case. At times, they disagreed operationally, and we saw this in southern Aleppo in May, June of this year. But it's done to have like short-term leverage. It's not done in a way to punish Assad because he misbehaved or he said something outrageous in a speech, etc. this is where I think Russian hands are tied in a way, is that they are dependent on what's happening on the ground. They don't necessarily call the shots on the ground all the time. What can the US do against Russia, I guess you asked, or in general? More sanctions, I mean, more sanctions on Syria. The Syrians have maxed out on sanctions. The population is suffering at every level. I think today is making the case for that. Targeted sanctions, well, they haven't had the desired effect. The Assad government has been more cohesive than a lot of people expected. Not that many high-level defections, including in the military, etc. So I don't see the sanctions as like a key element that can change anything. No-fly zones, again, I know that I'm very vocal about a lot of things, but the reality about no-fly zones is that the risks are very high and the cost is very high. The Americans and the others couldn't agree and couldn't do it before the Russians intervened. Look at how it's going to play out today. I don't think the Americans or anyone else is going to do something about Syria because it's Syria. I think the decision in Washington or elsewhere could be made, and again, it's entirely speculative, if there is a decision to push back against Russia in general. So Syria would be one theater in that confrontation. Ukraine, other places, cyber. There's many fronts to that thing. But in terms of Syria, it's very difficult to do. And then, a safe zone. Well, the Turks are creating a de facto safe zone. But how are they creating it? Because they have a quid pro quo or an agreement with the Russians. It's not that the Turks are doing what they're doing without Moscow being on board with that. So I think we've run out of a lot of options on this front. The question about Russian entanglement and perhaps it's the others actually suffering a cost much more than the U.S. Yes, this is how Obama would argue it. You say, we're out of the game. We're not spending treasure or blood in a country that is secondary to our interests, which is all fine as far as I'm concerned. I'm not a U.S. citizen. I'm an analyst. I look at these things and so on. It may make total sense. I lived in the U.S. I saw the trauma. During the Iraq War years, this trauma, how it poisoned everything, the cost, etc. But then the rhetorical policy, the statements have to follow. So no Assad must go, no red line, no, we won't accept outrage. No Samantha Power and many things. Sorry, I'm going to say it, but if you don't want to intervene, which is all fine and may make total sense in terms of your insurance, shut up and move away. That's the issue. That's perhaps the greatest criticism in terms of Obama. I always go back to the speeches that Obama gave in August and September 2013 when they were gearing up for the strikes after the use of chemical weapons by Assad. Look at the rhetoric. Look at Kerry going to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and saying this is a key moment. This is Munich 1938 again, etc. They built that thing to be hanged. They offered us the rope on this. So that's why it's a lot of cynicism, but it needs to that matters. What you announce publicly in terms of your goal, it does matter. But again, I think domestically we saw this during the U.S. debates. No one talks about Syria. So yeah, you're right. It's priority number 3 or 4. The problem are the aftershocks. Look at the refugee crisis. Look at that about ISIS. In early 2014, Obama gave an interview to The New Yorker in which he described ISIS as the JV team of terrorism. You know what JV means. It's the junior varsity, the high school compared to the NBA. That's when ISIS was growing. And we're like, hey man, you're sitting on a $60 billion intelligence community budget. And they didn't tell you that actually that was a jihadi monster in the making? Because we were saying that. And there's a problem of assessment. And that's where that's the real divergence with things. Syrian civilians protection. I think that's a priority, to be honest. This country is bleeding. It's bleeding at every possible level. Go read Peter Harling's latest piece. You can just type Peter Harling on Twitter or whatever. Yeah, the Syrian trauma. you know, I talk like a political analyst, perhaps not that good at the human thing. You know, he is very good at the human thing. And you have an entire society that is just fundamentally broken, okay, that, you know, has a trauma that we can't even think of. You know, the first thing is, you know, to think about civilian protection. And there's a lot of things that, you know, both the rebels, the opposition, but also the regime and whatever have to compromise over for that, that greater thing. The point today is that unless the skies are clear, they're going to go and they're going to seek protection from whomever they can. And that's not an ideological commitment. You know, I mean, again, I lived that during the war. I remember, you know, the militias around the corner and the checkpoints, etc. And most of us accepted that because we, you know, parents wanted to send their kids to school. They wanted to get food. They didn't want to get into trouble. People make rational, very tactical choices that don't necessarily reflect. And that was, by the way, ISIS' great claim early on, is that, hey, we're coming to bring order. I mean, this is the Raqqa tragedy or Mosul or whatever, is that, hey, you know, all these others are corrupt and violent and so on, we're doing it.
The rhetorics of the protection of the useful Syria that is made by the regime.
I mean, look, the regime makes that point. And it's right. The regime, most IDPs in Syria moved to regime-controlled areas for several reasons. One is that rebels and jihadis are sometimes terrible, if not totally awful, in terms of governance. Sometimes it's understandable because they're being bombed from the air, because they can't create, you know, the local mechanism. You know, no one can look at Daraya, the place where actually you did have civilian governance and where the militias were actually responding to a local civilian council and say, this didn't happen. It was debilitating. Sometimes people, you know, do prefer the regime over the rebels or thing, which is also, but there's also another element there. In regime areas, you don't get barrel bombed or attacked by chemical weapons or anything, and that matters. And the second point is that, hey, humanitarian assistance gets to IDPs in regime-held areas. It doesn't get to many rebel-held areas. That matters, right? You want to feed yourself and your kids. So, you know, a lot of decisions are tactical. It's not entirely about your loyalty, where your loyalty resides. And finally, regional powers. God, I speak so much. Look, regional powers see Syria as basically the place that's going to decide the balance of power in the region. Okay? They've invested massively, but they're mostly, how do you say, incompetent and destructive. I mean, they don't know how to conduct proxy war. They don't necessarily understand Syrian society. I mean, a great example for me is Turkey. Turkey just somehow in 2011, especially 2012-13, Turkey believed that because it had this 10-year long relationship with Syria, when, you know, good relations between Erdogan and Assad and so on, they had a great insight into Syrian society. They had joint military exercises, intel, etc. So the reality is that Turkey was largely clueless about Syrian society, but they convinced themselves they had this thing. And they convinced themselves that whomever they were talking on the Syrian opposition side, especially the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood early on, etc., was somehow like representative of the Syrian people, whatever that means. And it's, I mean, you know, I say this about Turkey, it's also the case about Qatar and Saudi, right? Everyone wants to believe that they have some special insight into some other society. Well, no one really understood Syrian society. It changed so massively in the past couple of decades. All of us researchers, almost all of us, were interested in either regime dynamics or the regime regional policy. But Syria in and of itself, who really cared about? I mean, you know, it was an understudied country. It was difficult to research. So there's a new Syria that emerged, and those and it takes time for, you know, regional powers to admit, you know, that their investment really hasn't paid. Now, the country that has invested and is waiting to see the returns, I would argue, is Iran. Iran has expertise, experience, and strategic patience that dearly lack elsewhere in the region. It's no defense of Iranian strategy, but it's just a recognition that Iran knows how to conduct asymmetric warfare much cheaper than the Saudis or anyone else who can't conduct this. But I think the Iranians are better positioned because they also have strategic patience. They make an investment today and they're able to wait a decade before seeing the return. The others are certainly not in that position. And I think regional powers are still putting stuff in Syria, but they can't. If you go to Riyadh or Ankara or whatever, and you tell them, hey, what do you want to see in Syria? They have a wish list. They don't have a clear end goal. And I have a wish list. I want a Bugatti, but it's just like not going to happen.
Are these two involvement to compare, Emile?
What?
The Iranian involvement
And
the Turkish, Qatari, Saudi.
I mean, it's very difficult to. I spoke a lot about. I made that comparison at a talk a couple of months ago about the the Saudi-Iranian competition. I think it's very difficult to evaluate how they're how they're competing, the costs, etc. Because they're totally different systems. In Saudi Arabia, policy is highly personalized, therefore very volatile. In Iran, policy is highly institutionalized. Iran operates at a much lower cost than Saudi Arabia. Iran, those who make the decision in Iran in terms of security and regional policy, tend to sit at the extreme right of the political spectrum. Okay, so they're not worried about being bypassed to their right. I mean, Khamenei doesn't wake up and say, "Oh, someone is going to have an even more hardline policy on Syria than I do." That's not the case in Saudi Arabia. I mean, in Saudi Arabia. Often, its policies tend to feed the ideational and strategic threats that challenge Saudi rule over time, etc. I mean, so I would not. I mean, yes, we need to compare them, but you can't make a strict, quantifiable comparison between the two. I'm just saying, if I were a betting man, Iran looks, a more competent ally. Just purely on the level of competence, Iran looks like the more competent ally. Then the question is, what is the Iranian thinking? How do they rationalize their investment? What are decisions in Tehran? Is it worth continuing or not? I mean, that's a totally different topic. But yeah, sorry.
Amazing. I'll take a second round of questions. Yes, please.
Good evening. I'm Salman Mughrabi. Here.
Salman.
I have 2 points to talk about. 2 days ago, I have relatives in Damascus, living in Damascus. I have relatives living in Damascus. So 2 days ago, we were talking about the situation there. I was afraid that they are going to the Lebanese statu quo. The thing that it's okay, that's a bomb right there, that's a land rocket, that's an air-land rocket. So they know everything about weaponry in the last 4 years. It's good from a side that they're not afraid that much anymore, but it's bad because the thing of living the war or being in a war as a regular thing is very bad. The second thing is, if we want to go, look at the bigger picture a bit. If we go back in time to look at the Alliance of Nations, or Asbat al-Umam, that was in the 30s and 40s, it's the same way, it was working the same way as the UN is working now. It's far from everything. It works just if all the nations agrees on something. But the difference between back then and now, that no one wanna take Hitler's role now to start something, to start the war, or to break down this statu quo. We had 3 or 4. We had 3 or 4 economic breakdowns. So why no one is going to take this risk?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to give the mic to Dr. Bashar in the first row. I'm sorry.
Two questions. One is about what can be done, and one about understanding Obama's Syria policy. Regarding what can be done, you seem to be pessimistic what can be done unless there is just a global strategy against Russia. Why can't one think of something less ambitious, such as providing anti-craft missiles, which what they did in Afghanistan against the Russians, and that should empower the rebels, opening the southern front, and organizing the rebels, and coming as a more aggressive force in providing. We'd imagine that Clinton could do something like that, and that would create a different dynamic on the ground. If Russian airplanes and Syrian airplanes are starting to fall down, that will make a big difference. So that's on what can be done, and I think somebody might say there's something can be done. In addition to fighting the Russians on other fronts, Ukraine and cyberspace. Now, on understanding Obama's foreign policy in Syria, one option, and then which one? We both agree that if you put aside the perpetrators, the Russians, the Iranians, the regime, the main blame falls on US policy regarding Syria. The question is to understand that. Is it a kind of ideological stubbornness on Obama's part against the teeth of evidence because of his vision of American power, of shouldn't use your muscles too much? And is that the ideological thing, or is it kind of, as he wants to present himself as a real political calculation? Because on that front, even if you think of the interests of the US and its Western allies, the Syrian crisis has basically played a big role in fueling alternative right in Europe and with the Orange Man. He benefited a lot from the perception of immigration and Islam as a threat to the world. Of course, it has other layers of problems in the US, but that has fueled the alternative right, and that is a result of not doing something in Syria. So on the real political front, he fails. On the ideological front, so that's the explanation. That's obviously some form of false consciousness, that you want your ideology to win over any evidence against its success. Thank you.
Bashar. Alison, please.
Thank you, Emile, for the talk. I just wanted to give an observation and put a question to you. I was on the border, the Turkish-Syrian border, when the Russian bombardments began. And I met a woman who had fled Jarablus when the Kurds were fighting ISIS. And I said to her, well, you've lived under the regime, you've lived under FSA, Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS, and now maybe the Kurds, because she was considering going back shortly. And I asked her, like, if you could go back to one of those times, which one? And she said the regime, of course. And there was recently a survey conducted of Syrians in Lebanon, and they surveyed about 2,000 people. And of course, the majority, they supported the what they called the nationalist opposition, not Islamists. But a good chunk of people, something like 40%, supported.
Yeah, 36%, I think I saw.
So exactly, a very decent chunk supported the regime. And so I say this because this is looking at the majority sect in the country that's arguably suffered the most, and that we don't hear from as much. And I'm wondering, my question to you is, are policymakers in the West taking this seriously? Do they consider this worth their consideration? And if so, are they looking at a scenario whereas, you know, awful as it might sound, they might try to make a deal or find a scenario where the regime, the state, I think institutions, or the Assad regime, you can't just cut that, where that would stay, and in return, I guess through the UN auspices or somehow else, there would be monitoring mechanisms to try to minimize any kind of vengeance or bloodshed. And I think this is important because I talk to people at state, and it seems like the thinking has changed, where early on you had the idea that, okay, we have to have a horse in the game, we have to have leverage, and every time they've kind of upped the ante militarily, the regime's very committed allies have doubled down. So from what I understand from people at state, at least under Obama, they feel this argument is completely out the window, and it seems like they are looking at other scenarios. Thank you. Oh, and I'm Alison from NPR.
Thank you, Alison. I'm going to have to go to the back one time. The lady.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Natalia Sancha. I'm correspondent for El País, a Spanish newspaper. Thank you very much for your talk. I would like to make a question regarding the regional powers back. and especially focusing in Riyadh and the Gulf countries. In a moment like with the oil prices, their economy is going down. So I wonder what is your opinion in what is going to happen if the fundings going to the rebel side goes down, how it's going to affect the reshaping of the rebel side on the fight scene, and also how this is going to have any leverage on Russia's position towards the US, of course. Thank you.
Mademoiselle, then Yasser in the back.
Hi, Emile, thank you. You spent a lot of time talking right now about Russian leverage over the Syrian government and what's happening on that side. I'm actually interested in finding out how much leverage do the Americans and the West have on the opposition, especially those on the ground. Because what we saw, especially in the lead up to the cessation of hostilities with Aleppo, was a lot of back and forth over which groups were going to be party to it, which groups weren't, which groups were going to ally with Nusra, if you want, JFS instead, which weren't. And also when you're looking at the offensives on Aleppo, on Hama, and also in the south, a lot of them are led by Nusra and Ahrar al-Sham, but the other FSA groups are also joining with them. So if there does get to a point where you can talk about serious negotiations, how is it that you would be able to prevent these groups that don't necessarily adhere to Western policy or to opposition in the that are outside of Syria? How can you control those on the ground and ensure that there is some kind of step forward towards some kind of long-lasting peace? Thank you.
Oh, thanks for asking that question.
Yeah, please.
Okay, first, you know, the issue of normalization of violence, getting used to like the Lebanese-style level of violence, I think that would be dramatic. But that's, I think, part of the, you know, it's the most probable scenario. I would argue. Yes, people tend to, you know, when they're exposed to extreme violence, a lot less violence is suddenly more acceptable. They get used to the soft partition of the country, etc. I mean, it's still difficult to understand how this will happen in Syria because you have large number of IDPs. In Lebanon, and the IDPs were not such a crucial element. There was displacement of population, etc., but not in a way that you know, created that massive humanitarian crisis that we see. So it's important to look at this aspect, and I honestly don't have any real insight in terms of IDPs. And your other point, the UN and global governance, it's basically yes. I mean, global governance is being challenged. Norms have been eroded. You have, you know, had the use of chemical weapons, which wasn't punished, or actually the use was established, but the guilty party was not named in the 2014 report. You have, you know, other erosion of international norms, international humanitarian law, etc. So I mean, look, the UN is essentially, I think, hostage to you know, great power politics. And you know, Syria is linked to Ukraine, which is linked to Yemen. Which, I mean, you know, if the Russians are challenged in Syria, they could escalate either in Ukraine or in Yemen, for that matter. I mean, you know, they do have really good contacts. So what I'm trying to say is, the UN used to be the place where you would, in a way, try to localize the conflict and just bring it back and try to deal with it on its own terms. That's no longer the case. Professor Bashar, you know, what can be done? Anti-aircraft missiles. Look, it's very simple. If the Americans and others didn't have appetite to send manpads into Syria in 2012 and 13, where actually there were real, you know, there were ways to track them and make sure they didn't leak, etc. Sending them today in this you know, extremely complex terrain is costlier and riskier. You know, the Americans perhaps would be fine with rebels shooting down a Syrian aircraft, but hey, it happens to be a Russian one. I mean, then what do? You know, who manages this escalation? Don't get me wrong, I was in favor of, you know, an option like this one before, but now I see that the counter argument is pretty powerful. You know, in terms of escalation, in terms of risk aversion or risk-taking inclination. You know, opening the southern front is something else that you're right, that is on the table. The problem with the Southern Front is that they had, a number of serious setbacks, in part because of, in terms of organization, etc. They are focused today on Nusra and ISIS. This is, as I said, they're sort of essentially as a border guard. And we don't see like a massive Syrian pressure to reactivate the front. And this is actually the perverse effect of this kind of fighting, is that essentially when you're faced with massive violence, if your area is somehow calm, you want to keep it calm, even though some other area is being bombed. And this is what I mean by the regime able to have a nationwide strategy versus the rebels not having. The battlefield is atomized, and that's a reality. Perhaps something will happen on this front, and I know that there's a bunch of people who are making this argument in terms of the Southern Front. But with Jaish al-Islam and not Faylat al-Rahman, in Ghouta. Anyway, they fought this thing. Pardon? Yeah. I mean, but the point is that they've shrunk. Well, but it's also largely a Syrian rebel responsibility here, right? Like they decided to pick a fight among themselves after the killing of Zahan Aloush, and then the eastern Ghouta shrinks by 25%, 30%. So there is an element of a massive element of responsibility here. Obama's foreign policy, look, I will say it's highly cynical and it's highly realpolitik. I don't think it has to do with the ideology. I think Obama is he's a brilliant guy who thinks and probably overthinks issues on this front, and he has rationalized the Syrian disaster pretty well in his head. I mean, for a guy who exudes so much empathy and decency on most issues, when he talks about racism and whatever, every time he opens his mouth about Syria, it's like almost an insult to the thing. I mean, remember when they're not worth supporting their farmers and pharmacists and whatever. Like, why this? Especially at a time where actually the rebels were scoring victories. I mean, and it's not a good thing if you have revolutionaries who happen to represent like the active parts of society. I just think he sees this as, he doesn't want to be associated with this. He doesn't want his record to be in it. And the problem is that if anything, that's what people are going to remember because it's burning up in the last months of his war. I mean, he would have preferred the escalation to happen a bit later. I mean, and it's happening now. But I think it's very calculated. I think it's very cynical, and there's a lot of post facto justification on this. Is that, thank God we're not there. Look how bad it is. So yeah, that's what you say. Sorry, Ali, where the question about civilian choice. Sorry, I missed. I forgot who that was. Ali, sorry. I said Ali. I just apologize. You're right. I mean, a lot of people today want the regime, and they would prefer because they have when things are very bad today, people tend to have a very romantic vision of how things were before. And you see people who were pro-opposition and then became regime and so on, depending on the level of violence, depending on the perceived benefits on this side or that side, depending on the radicalization on the rebel side or not. All I'm saying is that these polls are important and at the same time needs to be put in context. Civilian choice varies massively during the war, and especially, and that's the Calvas work, etc. People side with who they think has the military upper hand at a specific time. So the regime today has actually greater support because people think that the rebellion is failing. It is more radical. That its foreign supporters are less willing to invest in, and the regime is winning. So it is a complex thing, and I would never pretend that either the regime or the rebellion, whatever that rebellion means, has majority support in the country. There is no majority support in those cases. Okay, people indicate preferences depending on very tactical choices. And that's the case here. A lot of people, refugees in Lebanon that I used to talk to, and I haven't talked to anyone recently in the past couple of months, but they would be pro-regime when they would talk, because that was, in a way to get a way back into the country. To say, if we declare our preference for the regime today, Lebanon is not a very hospitable place for them. They're worried that they're going to be stuck outside forever. So by asserting that preference, they may be saying some of it is genuine. Some of the support is indeed genuine. There is a lot of pain on the other side. All I'm
work with men, Syrian refugee men, doing this theater where they can try to get out their emotions. And he's gotten to the point with these men and the women's group where the women even shake his hand, and he said it's exactly the same percentages, 40-60.
I don't have any doubt about this, but again, it's like, people who say, let's have a presidential election in Syria today and see who wins. It's like ignoring the context of choice. And I'm telling you, I don't think that anyone has majority support. And I actually think people are, including in minorities, people hedge. It's about survival. I saw very clearly Syrians in 2013 who, wanted the strikes. And when the strikes were called off, they jumped on the other side and they're big regime supporters now. It matters. It matters everywhere. It matters in Yemen. We saw also changes on this issue.
I'm so sorry, I have to stop this discussion here.
No, the policy, it's not true that policymakers are not aware of it. Actually, they're very aware of that. I don't think there is a regime change policy in the West. If policymakers were on the other side, were following this, we would see a very different application on the ground. And that's not the case. So no, they are worried about this. And finally, you talked about vengeance and revenge. I get the point, and it's very important to provide security guarantees as part of an ultimate arrangement. I have, however, a very, very, very difficult time rationalizing current regime violence by saying, there might be future thing. It's a cycle that feeds itself. We tend to focus. Yeah, I understand. The regime or others. Just looking at a future potential scenario and not looking in this. And finally, the question about regional powers and funding for rebel groups. Funding for rebel groups varies. It's gone up and down. I would argue that now it's actually a bit lower. Regional funding for rebel groups started really in late 2012, early 2013. There was before, but it wasn't done in a sustained, structured way, etc. We saw countries, up their involvement at a certain point or decrease it, depending on, risk profile, etc. Does lower oil prices mean that they'll have fewer resources to do that? Yeah, I believe that's the case. I think Saudi faces real difficulties. They're spending billions on Yemen for the military intervention there. They have domestic issues to deal with. Are they going to drop totally the rebellion? No, in part because it's a question of self-image and pride, etc. Should they do it? I would argue no, as well, because not doing this is not providing the funding is not going to end the violence totally. If anything, I think it risks radicalizing more in some sectors. There's a very delicate balance to be played here. The question is whether you can enroll all these countries in diplomacy and in some diplomatic framework. And the last one, as I spent an hour and a half trying to convince you, is not really the appropriate framework on that. And finally, U.S. leverage on rebel groups and spoiler effect. Yeah, that's a massive, massive issue. And I would argue that the Americans have quite difficult relations with a variety of rebel groups. And essentially what happened, look, it's the way they proceed is so, there's a lot of ambiguity all the time in terms of their positioning. So I still don't know if Ahrar al-Sham actually supported the cessation of hostilities or rejected it, because I have statements by both on the behavior on the ground is that actually they supported it, but did they support it for very tactical reasons, or did it was because they were promised something? There are some indications. It's just very difficult to do that. The spoiler effect is indeed massive. The capacity of a group to create a mess in those conditions is real. And in this case, it's primarily Nusra. I think Nusra is in the game to spoil. I mean, and by the way, they're outside all these agreements, so legally, they're not crossing any line. They're just doing their thing. I mean, they are crossing every other line, but you see, I'm making a very limited point. This is, by the way, this is why the Americans and others have wanted to include as many groups from the opposition or from the rebellion as possible in this. Because the thinking is that if you just ask just these groups to abide by it, then all these groups have an interest in spoiling it. So you have to talk to as many groups, including those that we will find very radical and distasteful in that. Ahrar is a Salafi organization that, the kind of system it wants in Syria is probably not, the one that, the mainstream would want. It's very clear. And yet, that was a way to co-opt them. All I'm saying is that the problem is that there is no structured, and that's actually a good thing on the next one, organic relationship here, is that it's very transactional. The problem here is that if your face in the great power that is supposedly asking you to abide by all this and is negotiating, etc., is very low, and your credibility, then you naturally are going to develop spoiler behavior, and that's a risk. Look, I mean, the rebel groups it's such an array of forces at this point. It's so they behave so differently and so on. At the same time, they've managed to work together on a couple of large-scale operations. Latakia last year, breaking, even if it were very unsustainable. I believed it from day one. The siege of Eastern Aleppo, etc. But you can't. The problem today is that if you want to constrain their behavior and get them on board, you have both to punish them and to incentivize cooperation. And I don't think the Americans or others have the right mix. I think some people incentivize them too much without punishing them, and I think the Americans tend to punish them a lot more than incentivize them. So yeah, I mean, it's just not a satisfactory response, but that's the nature of the very volatile politics of the rebellion.
Well, I think time is up, Emile. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.